Welcome to this presentation of the Catholic Church. Divine Providence Parish is a member of the Archdiocese of Hartford. With campuses at St. Peter's Church and St. Joseph's Church, Divine Providence Parish serves the great community of New Britain, Connecticut. Permission to stream the music in this presentation courtesy of one license. Playbacks of all Divine Providence Parish presentations are available on YouTube. For more parish information, visit our Facebook page. And enjoy the presentation of Divine Providence Parish Television. Deacon Al.
Welcome, and to our Saint of the Month program. And this month, we are going to feature one of the most fascinating saints in the Catholic Church. And not only a saint, but this individual is one of the most written about people in history. And this saint is none other than Saint Joan of Arc. And she was born in a tumultuous time at this stage of our history. And I want to just back up a little bit and give a little groundwork into that history before we start, because it's kind of complicated, and I'm going to try and strip it down and keep it as simple as we can for clarity's sake. Now, in a time that became known as the 100 Years' War between England and France, there was a great deal of trouble for France during this time, because in 1392, Charles VI, the King of France, was declared insane. And he had that, when he was declared insane because of some of his actions, it set off a tremendous power struggle between two factions in France, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs. And both sides appealed to King Henry V of England for help. But England and King Henry saw a chance for their own country. They saw the division in France. And it's the old saying, united we stand and divided we fall. And that's what happened here with France. Because England, seeing this opportunity, didn't decide to help France out as those two groups requested, but decided to invade in 1415. And they defeated the French in battle, and henceforth there became a treaty known as the Treaty of Troyes, where Henry's son, Henry VI, would become the ruler, which in turn disinherited the rightful king, Charles VI, the son, who was known as Charles VII. And Charles VII, because of this, had to hide out in France. Now, he hid out because he did have loyal followers that knew he was the true king of France. But because of these political games, he had to hide. And worse, he was powerless to really do anything about reclaiming his rightful throne. Now, Saint Joan was born in the village of Domremy in January 6, 1412. And she was born to her parents, Jacques and Isabel Arc. Saint Joan was the youngest of 5 children. And Joan was a typical peasant girl at the time. And she was taught domestic skills and the Catholic faith by basically her mom. And she would tend with the animals and help with all the chores that the family needed. She was known around the village for her obedience to her parents, for being unselfish, and very kind and very generous. She often took care of the sick in the village and would visit the elderly. And she was also known for her religious piety and fervor. And she was often teased by her playmates as being too religious. And this countryside of Domremy is so beautiful. Even today, it's lush valleys and green hills, beautiful trees, but it was hardly a peaceful village or a peaceful time. And the French who sided with Charles VII, it's hard for us to understand how demoralized they were. But you've got to picture it and look at it from their point of view. Basically, every time the French soldiers would try to turn the power structure of the English military, that they knew they were going to lose. So imagine if you were, we'll make a sports analogy, if you're on a team and you know pretty much every time you go out, you're going to be beaten. And while sports is one thing, this meant a lot of death and destruction. Yet they still kept trying, but again, they were completely demoralized because of their losing to the English so often. In addition, it was very difficult for the local people and people like Joan's parents and the people that lived in villages like Joan's. Because, one side, the Burgundians, they sided with the English. And they did that because they had power and they had wealth and they looked to see where their bread was buttered, and they figured that was with the English. And these villages would be raided by bandits all the time, and the women were deathly afraid of being raped or kidnapped. And it was a scorched earth policy that these bandits would use. They would take their stores that the people had, and then they would burn the villages, their homes, what was left, so they could not survive. As a matter of fact, it was so prevalent at this time that there was a system in Domremy of warning bells that would warn the women and the children to hide when bandits were sighted. So a very, very difficult time to be brought up in for Joan. But the people had hope, because long, long ago, there had been an old prophecy that they had held on to, that a maid from Lorraine would come and free France from English rule. And Joan's village of Domremy was in the border of Lorraine. Now, I mentioned that St. Joan had all these domestic skills, was very pious, lived a very normal life until she was about 13 years old. And that's when everything changed for Joan and eventually changed for France. You see, because St. Joan began to be visited and spoken to by three saints: the all-powerful St. Michael the Archangel, St. Catherine of Alexandria, a very popular saint at France at that time, and St. Margaret. And they were very important to the people of France, these saints. And St. Michael, he was the first to appear to her. And he told her that St. Catherine and St. Margaret would soon come to visit her, and Joan was to listen to them. Now, St. Michael, we know, is a bold saint. He's the one that threw Satan out of heaven. And to offset that, God would send St. Catherine and Margaret, who were much more gentle with St. Joan. And at first, these saints would come 2 to 3 times a week. And their messages were very simple for Joan: be good, attend church often, and God would help her. But soon, as she grew older, the visits and the tone changed. Joan was given a mission from God to go to the royal family in France and drive out the English from Orleans and put Charles VII on the throne. Now, as any young teenager or teenage girl that got these messages or would hear something from God or looked at the enormous impossibility of this mission, she struggled with these messages. One thing I like about St. Joan, and we'll touch on this later, she's a very human saint, and that's what can draw us closer to her, because she is in many regards just like you and I. Now, women, for the most part, during this period of history, on top of it, were really second-class citizens, and they certainly weren't expected to lead battle-scarred veterans used to losing in military campaigns. But our lesson here, and the lesson that St. Joan and the people that followed her eventually, is that God does the impossible because St. Joan obeyed. And we live in a time tumultuous to ourselves right now. And there's not a lot of obedience. There's not a lot of obedience to parents. There's not a lot of obedience to the government. There's not a lot of obedience to the church. And we pay for that lack of obedience. And there certainly isn't a lot of obedience to God and His laws. And we definitely pay, not only as individuals, but as a society in whole, when we get away from that. So, at 16, she asked a relative, an uncle, to take her to Vaucouleurs to see the garrison commander, a gentleman by the name of Robert Baudricourt, to get permission to visit the French court that housed Charles VII in Chinon. And basically what he told her was, you young upstart, you go home and you tell your parents, your father, to box your ears for coming here and speaking so out of turn, young lady. Go home. And Joan did. But the voices persisted, and they got stronger. And God's plan would not be thwarted, because Joan not only shows us a lesson in following God with her obedience, but she persevered. And she went back the following year. And this time, Joan had the support of two of Baudricourt's soldiers, who, after listening and overhearing her, became two of her strongest supporters. And they were the ones that actually initiated a meeting where Joan predicted to Baudricourt a French victory at the Battle of Rouergue near Orleans. Now, Baudricourt scoffed at this prediction. But later, he received news that the French had indeed won this battle. And after so many losses, he believed that God had revealed this victory to St. Joan, and he granted her an escort to Chinon through hostile Burgundian territory. And it was also recommended by her companions, as well as the people at Vaucouleurs, that Joan dress as a male soldier and cut her hair to be less conspicuous when going through this enemy territory. Because to get there, they had to travel basically at night and be very secretive and very cautious unless they were discovered by enemy troops. So by dressing like this, cutting her hair, she would look more like a male rather than a female to draw less attention as they made their way through this enemy territory. Now, Charles had heard about this, of course, and he agreed to see St. Joan, but he would put her to the test because he wasn't sure. He had one of his court members dressed just like himself as king, and he dressed as a member of the court, inconspicuously. And when Joan was brought in to the beautiful castle area, she wasn't fooled. She went directly to King Charles and knelt before him, my dauphin, which was a word for king. And she also told Charles that God had revealed a message that she would reveal to him in private. Now, they went into a room by themselves. And when Charles came out, he was extremely happy. And he was stunned by whatever Joan told him. And he believed, more importantly, that Joan was sent by God. Now, some people, and it's kind of a legend is passed down, that when they were in that room, a crown, as that of a king, in gold, came down from heaven and alighted itself on Charles's head. Now, that may be true, it may be a legend, but whatever that message was that Joan had between Charles and Joan and God, he believed it came from God and was now on Joan's side. But politics being what they are, Charles' advisors were greatly concerned. You see, they were afraid, especially the English, that they would start rumors that Joan was a witch. And therefore, if she was a witch and it was a supernatural design that this happened, it would be from Satan. And therefore, Charles's crowning would be the work of the devil, and that would negate his kingship. So Charles wisely ordered an inquiry and a theological exam at Poitiers to verify Joan's claims. And this commission that was enacted found Joan to be a virgin, leading an irreproachable life, and she was a good Christian, possessed the virtues of humility, honesty, and simplicity. And the most important part, they agreed that this young lady's mission was from God. And so it was on to Orleans to lift the English siege. And Charles, he outfitted Joan with armor and a beautiful horse, and she was quite adept at riding the horse, quite adept at military use of swords that they let her borrow, and the lance. If you've seen any of the pictures of the knights of the old round table with King Arthur or any of that, you know what the jousting is, and she became very proficient. But the thing she liked best was her famous banner with the words Jesus and Mary, and the fleur de lis, which was an image of a flower that symbolized the French crown. And through a supernatural grace, she was told that she would find a sword specifically for her in the church of St. Catherine. And sure enough, riding out to that church and going into the church and going through some of the rubble, for it was a very old church, they found a sword. And after cleaning it up, that sword became a gleaming, beautiful sword that St. Joan carried in battle. And like all our missions, when we have them from God and we set forth and we're caught up with the Holy Spirit and we have a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of fire, and we set out and we've got such high expectations, and then we run into some roadblocks. And sometimes that fire, that expectation that we're going to do so much, kind of gets knocked down a little. And I mentioned that Joan was real good at perseverance, and that's what we need. And the message she gives us today in our time, in our mission, for each and every one of us in our individual lives, whatever that mission is to keep persevering and knowing that, like Joan going into battle, this wasn't going to be easy. Just like your mission won't be easy, because you're going into battle. You're going against Satan and his minions to fight for God and be a warrior for God. So we can expect challenges, but this is the time you were born in. This is your challenging times. Keep that faith, hope, perseverance, and obedience to God, and he will do great things through you, great things for your mission. Hold on to that hope. So, it wasn't easy for Joan. Demoralized soldier, always used to losing. In addition, here comes St. Joan, and she demands in these soldiers' camp, you're not swearing anymore. You guys are going to start going to confession and attend Mass. And then she proceeded to throw out what were known as camp followers, and they were prostitutes that commonly followed soldiers. Now, the men, you can imagine at this time, were like, are you kidding? But slowly over a period of time, these men witnessed Joan's holiness, and they witnessed her virtues, and they came to see these virtues and this holiness, and she won them over. And so the camp followers were gone, and the swearing stopped, and these battle-hardened veterans that had seen so much went on their knees and made their confession and received Jesus in the Eucharist at the Mass. Now, the French, now inspired and led by Joan, started to make headway. They engaged the English, and finally, they were victorious, and they gained consecutive wins. They captured the fortress at St. Loup and St. Jean de Blanc. Then they went and they captured the fortress around Les Augustins Monastery, which was very close to an important place near Orleans, where the English had laid siege to. And then they went in a bold move, led by St. Joan, and they took the English stronghold at Les Tourelles. And Joan, at this battle, was shot in the shoulder. But she emerged from the tent where they wanted her to stay, wounded, and went to rally the troops. Tremendous courage, because she knew she was the focal point. She was from God, and her mission was from God, and she needed to be out front. So even injured herself with this terrible bolt in her arm, she led those troops to that victory at that stronghold. Now, you think everything would start to get smooth, but unfortunately, the high-ranking commanders, they dismissed all these victories, and they dismissed, more importantly, her military strategy when it came to Orleans. After all, what could this young upstart of a girl know of war, even if she had won a few battles? And this frustrated Joan to no end. But God was about to intervene. Because you see, these commanders and their army needed to bring supplies across the River Loire. And they had and wanted to do it under the cover of darkness. But what was happening was this strong wind was stopping their advance. They could not cross. They could not get over to that side of the river and engage in battle and have the necessary equipment and foodstuffs that they needed. And Joan came out of her tent when the problem was presented to her. she exclaimed, "My help comes from the King of Heaven." And the wind stopped immediately, and it allowed the French troops to cross. Now, after that, the commanders did believe in her, and they began to listen to her strategies. And in turn, when engaging the English, for a change, knew they were beat. They were starting to get demoralized, and they had to lift the siege. And once the English left, with great fanfare and pomp, Joan and the troops were led and cheered and honored. And people started to touch Joan, thinking she was divine and a saint. And she quickly reminded them, "Guys, girls, I'm just a human being just like you. All this is God. All the credit belongs to God. I am not God. I am not divine. I'm like you." And our lesson here is, that's right. We are creatures created by our Creator. And when we're given that mission by God, it's all Him that does it. And that's why we can have hope. That's why we can have confidence. Because if the Spirit is truly working through us, we can do the impossible through God. And Joan knew that. And she was doing the impossible. And we'll talk about that later. So, St. Joan takes her army, and she begins to depart for the Loire Valley campaign. And they're not done with their victories yet. They captured the city of Jagot, and then they take a fortified bridge, an important strategic place called Meung-sur-Loire, and they go on to liberate Beaugency, and then they go on to win the greatest victory they had at Patay. And again, now those English that started to be demoralized knew what the French troops like, because they were totally demoralized. And that opened the door for the great coronation, because for a king to be crowned, it had to be done in the cathedral. It had to be done by the bishop. It was such a solemn ceremony. To be legitimate king, this had to happen. And Joan met up with Charles and his contingency at Glen. And they began this historic, joyful march to Reims, where he would be crowned King of France. And Joan, can you imagine how she must have felt with this impossible mission that couldn't succeed? The odds against her. A teenage girl, 17 years old. And she stood beside, with her most treasured possession, that banner with Jesus and Mary. And it was her greatest moment and her high point. Because sadly, after this, things begin to change for Joan. Because politics, again, would rear its ugly head. And Joan's advice to go and march right on to Paris while the iron was hot was really, including Charles VII, the king, not seriously taken. And when they finally, after hemming and hawing, gave consent, it didn't go well at all. You see, St. Joan was hit with a bolt from a crossbow. And while she wanted to stay urging the troops on, they ignored her. They ignored her orders. And they carried her from the field. And when they did that, the assault, which they were advancing, stopped. They lost their momentum. Now, Joan intended to resume that assault. She had every intention of winning that battle. But King Charles, he ordered them to withdraw. And then, inexplicably, to this day, the orders were given for her army to be disbanded. And truly, that was a turning point. And I mentioned the crowning at Reims was a high point for Joan because, as we'll see, things begin to turn. Now, one of the things Charles VII did, and we don't want to be too hard on him because, you know, the political aspect at the time, he had his advisors. They may have thought this was the right thing to do. You know, sometimes people are used in politics, and then once their usefulness they felt is used up, well, you know, it's time to get kicked in the corner a little. And the other thing, and a very human thing, because we're all human beings, we're all sinners, is Joan was very popular, possibly more popular than Charles VII. And, you know, we have that biblical study, right? what happened to King David when David was winning these battles, and Saul was very upset, and he wanted to kill him because David was more popular. And here, this might have been the case where Charles VII was not as popular as St. Joan. But what he did do is he elevated St. Joan and her family to nobility. But she didn't want this. And she went, probably because of her family, but as an unwilling guest. And then Charles tried to placate her, but he let her leave and join some troops that were still fighting at Lagny. And it is here where we have a miracle. Because St. Joan came upon a dead child. And those distraught people asked for her intercession. And she did pray for that child. And the child came back to life and had this miraculous recovery. And when Joan went to rescue a town that was under siege by the English at Compiègne, this is where Joan, famously, is pulled from her horse. The drawbridge is quickly raised that separated her from her army, and she was captured by the Burgundians. And Joan, it was a great prize, the Burgundians. They were overjoyed because they still thought she was a witch, and they had captured the witch. And they held her for 10,000 livres. And several attempts were made to free her by Charles, but they all fell through. And in Joan's humanness, and we'll talk about this, she tried to escape as a good soldier will. And she tried this several times, including one time jumping from a tower over 70 feet and fortunately landing in the soft earth, which stopped her from being hurt too badly. But it was to no avail because her escape attempts failed miserably. And when we look at this, we can see it, if we look at it from Joan's point of eyes, you're locked in a tower with basically English troops that you've defeated and French people that don't like you. And she was verbally and physically abused. And one of the reasons I mentioned before, Joan wearing that clothing was to be inconspicuous during the travel in enemy territory. But she wore this clothing, too, to avoid being raped. In fact, a great English lord at that time entered into prison and tried to take her by force. And the English, they were desperate to try her as a heretic. And they wanted to discredit Charles's kingship. And again, going back to if they could prove that Joan was a witch, what the French court feared, then his kingship would be null and void. So desperate were they paid the Burgundians 10,000 gold coins. And this resulted in one of the most, and you can check this on the internet if you take the time, it's fascinating reading, the Trial of Joan. Not only is her trial of her condemnation, but also her rehabilitation trial is also copied word for word as it was taken down in this time in the Middle Ages. Matter of fact, Joan's trial is one of the most kept historical documents and best kept of all time. And again, it's a fascinating read. But the trial, when we look at it, was actually a farce that violated every legal process of the Middle Age times. Now, Nicholas Bailey, he was a clerical notary. He was assigned to collect testimony against Joan, but he couldn't find any evidence. And even though the court lacked grounds to try her, they went ahead with her trial anyway. And worse, they denied Joan legal counsel, and they filled their tribunal with pro-English clergy, rather than meeting the medieval requirements to balance the group with impartial clerics, even though Joan had asked for this and was her right. Now, the vice inquisitor, Jean Lamatrie, to the trial from the he was there from the trial at the beginning, but he was favorable to Joan. But then eyewitness reports came later that said this vice inquisitor was forced to cooperate because the English threatened him with death. And we can see again, not much changes in history. The faces do, but we see the same things from the beginning of our time to right now at this moment here in June in 2021. And despite all this, and one thing we've got to remember is Joan was an illiterate peasant. She learned some stuff from her mom and some stuff from her dad, but she wasn't educated by any way, shape, or form. And yet, despite being challenged by these learned men in a stacked deck against her, she held her own. And many of words that Joan used are verbatim taken down, and you could read again those in the trial. And it's really, you can see the supernatural workings in here when you hear her replies. And one of the best-known exchanges was when Joan was asked if she was certain she was in God's grace. And it was a trap, because church doctrine stated that no one could be sure of being in God's grace. So if Joan said yes, she would have been charged with heresy. And if she said no, she would have confessed her own guilt. And she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me." The court was stupefied by her reply. And many members of the tribunal later testified that important parts of this trial transcript had been altered from the original to convict Joan. And despite the lack of any incriminating evidence in this trial, Joan was condemned as a heretic and sentenced to death by her worst fear. And that was being burned at the stake. As she used to say, fear of the fire. And what they would do is in her tower cell, they built that scaffold where they were going to burn her at the stake to play mind games with her, to let her hear the wood being joined together, the shouts of those building it, the taunts. And it all worked on her psychologically because, again, it wasn't just physical abuse, it was psychological. And when the day came, Joan's head was shaved, and they put her in a cart, and they paraded her around the town of Rouen to aid in humiliation. And she was tied to a tall pillar, and the fire-burning material was stacked below her. And then they ignited it. And she asked for a crucifix to be held in front of her, but there was none around. So one of the English took 2 sticks from that fire material and fastened it to a cross until that crucifix could be held in front of her. And as she stared at that crucifix, and the fire and the smoke began to consume her, her last words on earth were, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." And after she died, the English made sure that they raked the coals to expose any part of the body because they didn't want rumors that she escaped. And then, after they did that, they burned that 2 more times so no one could collect any relics of St. Joan. So everything was reduced to ash except her heart. And when that was discovered, the English leader said, "You take that heart, you put it in a sack, and you throw it in the Seine River." But it was enough that one English soldier exclaimed, "We have just burned a saint." And that could have been the end. But God wasn't about to let the person he chose for this mission to free France be condemned like that. He was going to vindicate her. And a posthumous trial was opened after the Inquisitor General and Joan's mother requested it. And after investigation and many witnesses testifying that the original trial was once again fraudulent and changed, and the deck being stacked against Joan's character, a formal appeal was granted in November 1455. And on July 7th, 1456, she was declared innocent. And the Bishop of Orleans in 1909 led efforts for Joan's beatification. And she was finally canonized a saint in 1920 by Pope Benedict XV. Now, the miracles, as you know, the saints once they're beatified, they need the miracles to become canonized, to make sure that the church declares, yes, we know this person is in heaven. It is the only time the church pronounces that a person they know is definitely in heaven, and that's through the canonization process. And it's a very difficult process. Every type of investigation, physical, psychiatric, the miracles, they're all sifted through with fine-tooth combs, dissected. And for them to be considered a saint, it has to be without any little stain of controversy. It has to be 100% on the money. So the miracles attributed, one was the child. Remember, we said that earlier, that child St. Joan prayed for was brought back to life. The other miracles that attributed were the calmings of the wind at the River Loire. And then the big one, and we'll talk about this for a minute, because that was France eventually winning its freedom from English rule. Now, people today, modern historians, we've talked about this in some other programs, about revisionist history, changing the history of the times past to fit the people of that time's history, ours, for instance, with our philosophies and our beliefs. So we live in an age now where the supernatural's kind of knocked down, that, we can explain everything through science, and what we don't know, we just haven't had an answer yet. And yet, I think the question here we need to ask, and ask ourselves when we talk about miracles, whether they be Eucharistic miracles or of other saints, or maybe the miracles you've witnessed and had in your own life. St. Joan was a teenager, and from a 2-year period, because she didn't have a long life, died at 19. So from 17 to 19, she did all these things. An illiterate peasant girl at a time when women were, to say second-class citizens is actually a compliment. They were nothing. And then for a 17-year-old girl to go and lead battle-hard troops, never being in the military, but having military strategy from heaven, winning victory after victory, and then freeing France, and that actually changing history as we know it today. It would be a much different world if that didn't happen. Has to be of supernatural design. To try and explain that away as Joan's voices were all hallucinatory, that's all they wore. She made them up because she was overly pious. Doesn't explain for dead children coming back to life. Doesn't explain a wind that stops suddenly so troops can cross. Doesn't change the fact that France did win its freedom, and that Joan got this group of people because of her holiness, because of her virtue, to follow her when they had been beaten and knew they were going to lose every time out. And that's supernatural. So don't let people try to kid the supernatural away in our beautiful faith, because it's there and it's real. And it's real in your life, it's real in my life. We just have to be open to see the supernatural in our lives. It's there. Now, what we need here, there were 3 miracles of healing from Joan's intercession also. St. Teresa of St. Augustine was healed of a leg ulcer by praying to St. Joan. Sister Julia Gauthier was healed of breast cancer, and Sister Marie Sanger was cured of stomach cancer, all after praying for St. Joan's intercession to God. So you can see that St. Joan, had many miracles, and don't be afraid to pray to St. Joan now in any problems or anything in your life and asking for her intercession. Now, some of the things we can learn at our time today from St. Joan is that no matter what our status in life, no matter what our status, with faith, obedience, and trust in God, we can accomplish anything. I mentioned that despite these astronomical odds that seemed impossible, and even though she didn't live to see this, she did fight for France. and the country that she loved so desperately, and did get France to win its freedom from that English yoke. And Joan is that perfect example of perseverance. You know, when we are ridiculed, ignored, or feel that everything we do comes to nothing, that's when I think we need St. Joan's intercession and to pray for her, to help pushing us forward. Because we know that we meet these stumbling blocks, and it can be demoralizing, just like those French troops. And many times we want to throw in the towel. But that prayer to St. Joan for her perseverance, that can push us through that last little step that opens that glory and that gateway to the Holy Spirit to do marvelous, miraculous things in our lives. And, you know, when Joan came out after being wounded and all seemed lost, it didn't appear she could get a victory. And we want to remember that, as I just mentioned a second ago, that when all seems lost, it may be just that little opening that we need to get what we desired. Because many of us, too, like St. Joan, have been wounded by someone emotionally. And again, we just want to chuck that towel in. But if we can try to remember St. Joan's courage in trusting that we sincerely are seeking God and His will and the mission in our life that He wants us to do, He will look after us. And we also must remember that, like Joan in that supernatural aspect of our life, that God's first and foremost will for us is to spend eternity with Him. And therefore, when things don't go the way we expect them to, we try, like St. Joan did, to look and see with the eye of eternity that God does. And we will see that we do indeed, like St. Joan, get the victory. Now, St. Joan went frequently to confession and Mass and received Jesus in the Eucharist. And she had a strong prayer life. And this is where she got those graces to carry her through the most difficult times in her brief life, including that death. Because she faced her greatest fear. Because they did torment her and play mind games with the fire, because they knew that was her greatest fear. And in her very humanness, which makes her so dear to me, and I think many of us, is that in a moment of weakness, she did cave and have doubts and give in to those powers that seemed just so oppressive. But when she thought and prayed, she realized, no, I can't trade my soul. I can't deny the truth of God. I can't deny who I am in Him and the mission He gave me. You take your best shot and do what you got to do. And she faced her greatest fear with incredible courage. And again, the last 3 words of her life were Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Another thing we can learn from Joan, one of her greatest attributes, is her humility. She didn't want any honors, even when King Charles wanted to elevate her. And Joan came to serve. That's something we can learn. And that's how God worked wonders through Joan, because she was humble. And when we have that humbleness, when we have that humility, God is going to work wonders in our life. And maybe all of us can try to be humble and honorable like St. Joan, and trying to overcome the battles that we all face in our lives. And like I had mentioned, her greatest fear of fire, moment of weakness, but she overcame it. It helps us to realize we're not perfect, and we can have those moments of doubt and weakness. But when we take God into account and we trust in Him and His mercy, and we know, just like St. Joan did, that God is a God of second chances. And with His grace, as she overcame her greatest fear and became a saint, so can we. St. Joan, pray for us.